Welcome to episode 18 of Carole Tuesday, the Shinichiro Watanabe show about people who do music or music that somehow does people. Anyway, last week we saw this episode where Erdogan kind of descended into broke homelessness. He ended up staying at Roddy's place, and the whole episode kind of had a mixture of A and B stories. Some were about Carole Tuesday actually making an album with that producer that nobody likes. Some was about Angela's stalker. Some was about that political reporter guy who's trying to get the scoop on Tuesday's mom. And in between, we had Erdogan kind of trying to rediscover his musical talent. And it just so happens that Angela's going to sing his song, or whatever, to try to get him back to where he used to be because he got scammed out of all of his money by an AI manager doll who just so happens to look like Pinocchio. So that was last episode. Fun episode, all in all. I really liked it. So without further ado, let's get started with this episode. This is kind of the subplot that I wanted to see with the other stalker that Carole had way back in the day. But I guess they thought that for her storyline, which is more like low tech and uninvolved with that kind of stuff, it wouldn't really make sense. So they then just like ported it over to the Angela storyline, which I'm mostly fine with. Like, I don't really mind Angela getting her own stalker sub-arc, but keep in mind this is the second time this has happened in the show. And while this time it's more like traditionally male type attack, like he's very domineering and controlling and wants to like possess her, whereas before it was basically the same thing but coming from the other girl, Sibel. It feels kind of like they're trying to comment on the other parts of the society that this guy is exploiting to make himself a nuisance to her. Like, he can contact her at any time because of the online platforms that make reaching a celebrity very easy. He hacked a self-driving car. Is it a coincidence that he hacked a self-driving car? I don't really think so. I think they're trying to make a point here, like, oh, you think you're safe, but you can hack a self-driving car. Now, for the actual like fact of hacking a self-driving car, it's not impossible. Is it difficult? Probably yes. Will it be less difficult in the future when they're more networked? Probably yes. So it's not like this is entirely out of the ordinary or something unimaginable that's happening. Also, that guy isn't that too badly injured. He's just in the hospital, but he can still move around and talk and stuff. And he never added anything to the like he never added much to the show anyway, that Aaron guy. So do we really miss him? No, not really. It would have been, to me, more like an emotional impact, or I would have felt more like, unsafe if they had gotten to her manager, because as love-hate as their relationship is, she's much closer and she's known her for way longer than Aaron guy, which leads me to believe that this is just a subplot that we have just for the sake of having it. And while the consequences of it, like when he eventually shows up and confronts her, are going to be somewhat more disturbing than this, I feel like we could have been along that path much sooner, and I feel like it would have been more effective that way. That being said, it really is just a B story. Like, you need a B story to keep the, episode moving along. So I'm not going to pick on it too much. Maybe I've already picked on it too much. But other than that, I don't really have much to say about that Angela Stalker subplot. So we've come full circle. If you remember way, way back in the day, I think before even the talent show arc started, they performed, or were set to perform at the Cydonia Fest. And that's when we met some of the more famous people that they know, like the Beyonce stand-in, and this other guy who's like an R&B singer type guy. That was way back, like episode 5 or 6 maybe. And they never got to perform because the act that they were going to stand in for just showed up. And that like singer guy who's a notorious like flake, he usually gets drunk and sometimes doesn't even show up. He did show up, drunk or intoxicated as he was, and he performed anyway, and they never got the chance. So now we're going full circle. This is kind of, I think the show is making a point of this. Is like, they had a song initially. It's what got them attention. They got almost put in the Cydonia Fest, and it didn't end up working out. They went to the talent show. They did well, even though they were supposed to be disqualified. They technically, co-won the event. Then they went back and started making their debut single, which did well, and then they got approved for an album, and now they're playing at the Cydonia Fest again. And Cydonia Fest is like a stand-in for every huge music festival that exists in the world, which is pretty much how everybody makes their money these days. No one sells albums anymore. So these people are going full circle. They've achieved that status finally that they wanted to achieve, and they've been invited to the rookie stage. Keep in mind, last time they were supposed to play the main stage, they were invited to the rookie stage of the Cydonia Fest, and they're super excited about it, as we should be probably too. I wonder if they're going to tell us what ranking on the top 100 their single reached this week, because the week before last we were at 52, last week we were at 18. Maybe we can crack the top 10 this week. Who knows?
あのさ、気をつけなよ。
So this is where the show is at its best to me. Like when we're just sitting in the apartment with Carole and Tuesday talking about stuff that isn't directly happening in their immediate vicinity, and they're just kind of concerned about themselves and what they're going to do and like what they should do, and all this like existential worry is where the show is at its best to me. For you, it might be something else, but for me, it's like this kind of lo-fi atmosphere with that, like guitar playing in the background or that soft piano playing in the background, is where the show works really the best, because just these two characters we've grown to know so well, and we kind of enjoy their company more than anybody else on the show. And just hanging out with them and just hearing what they have to say is kind of what makes the show, tick for me. And without these scenes, I think probably the show would be, in a far worse state than it is now, because I feel like the show is trying to ramp up its scale and like push up to the level of Mars as a planet, and like talk about immigration from Earth and all that. And while I do, like that as a scientific experiment, like kind of just as a background, something to look at while Carole and Tuesday do their stuff, I do much prefer the story of Carole and Tuesday, which is good because that's what the show is about. And it really just reminds me of Terrace House, if you've ever seen that. It's really about like 20-somethings, early to late 20-somethings, just trying to find their way in the world, figuring out who they are, what they want to be, what they want to do, and just talking about their insecurities and everything. And I know I've mentioned this a long, long time ago. I thought I'd just bring it up in case you haven't seen that one. But that's really what these scenes remind me of, and really this show shines when it's at its lowest point in the scale, like when it's not too worried about what's happening even outside the four walls of their apartment, to me. So he's talking to her about this like supposed scandal that he wants to uncover about her mom, and he mentions that he thinks that something is going to change with society, like they're even doing analysis of the public's opinions to decide on policy, and he's acting like this is a new thing, whereas in our timeline we've already seen this. Like people pick the most public friendly version of any policy that can be sold to everyone as being something good, while still serving the interests that fund their campaign or whatever it is, which is something we haven't really seen that much here. Even in this show, cynical as they're trying to be, they still are not as cynical as the real world actually is. They're not saying like, oh, they want the policy that best can be sold to the public while still serving some like ulterior motive. They left that part out. They're just saying they want the version of the actual politician's beliefs that can be sold to the public, which is not usually the case. So good try, show. I know you're trying to be like cynical and dark, but the real world is much worse. Well, that went in a way I didn't expect. So we had a random attack of terror on a weather plant, which is what's keeping the surface of Mars even livable. And now, Valerie's like declaring victory, like, hey, I said this was going to happen. This had to have been done by refugees from Earth. There's no other way this could have been done. And it just so happens that in a time of stress and a time of great, grief, if your strong man steps forward, people vote for them. They showed us President Hamilton, after a long time. He's basically the Obama stand-in, whereas Valerie Simmons is like the Hillary Clinton plus Donald Trump mashed together stand-in, the looks of one, the policy of the other. And it seems that her whole goal is to like try to get this anti-immigration policy passed. She doesn't seem to really have any like economic motive for that. It just seems to be like a personal motive, which is where I take issue with it, as I mentioned earlier. That being said, this is kind of a weird twist to the plan, and now like Carole and Tuesday are bunkered up in their apartment with soup cans and winter coats because the temperature of Mars is dropping very quickly. Obviously this is going to swing a lot of votes towards Valerie. I was just wondering why we had really no foreshadowing of this, other than her political consultant being like, I've already put the next step into action, which is their show's way of telling us that Valerie did this to try to get votes to swing her way because she was still 5 points behind Hamilton. And the last poll and the election's coming up very soon, so she needed something to swing her way. Like if you're saying absolutist kind of make America great again type stuff, you're going to get more votes when people are scared than when they're not. That's just how it works. And she seems to understand that very well, and that's what she's doing. So good on you, Valerie, for understanding the public. So that was episode 18. I kind of didn't talk a lot for the last maybe 6 minutes of this episode just because it was just repercussions of what happened in the first 14 minutes. They bombed the weather plant. Mars is really cold now. Kyle interviewed her a few times. They seem to develop a rapport. He showed her his notebook. He's like, can you show me a notebook? You know, like, I want a notebook. They don't really sell them anywhere anymore. I guess he got to her heart from that because she went back for the third interview. She saw him like canoodling with a different lady and she got her heart broken and then she just walked out. But the way that they showed her face when she walked out, like it was almost like she had a heart attack or something. And the only really time they've even insinuated that she had any affection for Kyle is when she blushed for like a second earlier in the episode. And then to be so shocked when he's talking to another woman is like, is this really the most shocking thing in the world? He seems like, you know, kind of a guy who would know a lot of women. You know, he's been around the world. He's kind of dashing, charming. He's a wartime reporter guy. These are all traits that tend to accelerate this type of familiarity. But Carole, or no, not Carole, Tuesday apparently didn't think of this. And when she walked into that rooftop cafe, she got shocked. Other than that, this episode, I would think, continues the trend of the past 2 or 3, where we're just slowly building up to something. In every episode, we learn a few more details. I would say the underdeveloped plot this episode would be Angela's stalker thing. She basically just got 2 messages from him and went to visit Aaron in the hospital. We barely, by barely, I mean we saw one scene of them in the studio with Toby. He basically just said, good job making a good piece of crap song. The rest of the episode was just Kyle and Tuesday, and then a little bit of drama about the weather plant being blown up and Valerie Simmons, her mom, doing things she probably shouldn't be doing. A good episode, all in all, I would say. The show is getting to the point where you kind of have to watch it all the way through to kind of get into that like lo-fi atmosphere and kind of just enjoy the feel of the show, which I think is kind of a hallmark sign of all Shinichiro Watanabe shows, is that they're kind of just there to be cool. That being said, you know, there are action shows. I'm not saying there's not action in the shows. I'm saying it's really more about the feel and the atmosphere. And when you watch them back to back, I feel like that really adds to it. But when you're watching week to week like this, you do get a nice little hit of Carole Tuesday every week. That's true. But if you're not careful, you can lose track of what happened last episode just because it's going, you know, at a measured pace. And that's not really to the show's detriment per se. It's more like the show is doing its best to not speed up and slow down like it used to before, because it really sped up the first 6 episodes, and then from episode 6 to episode 13 we had that whole talent show arc, which still to me is pointless. I know some people liked it because it had music and characters and whatnot, and that's fine, but for the whole purpose of the story, we basically just stopped what we were doing at episode 6 and picked up at episode 13. And I think if you were watching the show and you just saw the introduction to the talent show and jump cut to the end when they tie with Angela, I don't think you would miss much. Not really much happened in between. We were introduced to a few characters like Kyle, but other than that, not really anything happened. The episodes since then have been much better in my opinion. We're almost to the finish line here. We're 3/4 of the way through 18 out of 24. We only have 5 episodes left, or 7 episodes left. And I wonder what the show is going to do in this time, because we're slowly building up to the point where Carole and Tuesday unite Earth and Mars. That's going to be the finale. We know that. I'm not sure if this show is looking for a second season. It doesn't look like it is, because it's exploring everything that possibly could be explored, even in the first season. I don't think it's getting a second one. Remember that this is a Netflix show at the end of the day, so all 24 episodes are going to be up after they all air in Japan, almost a half year later than people even cared about it at all. And I haven't mentioned this in maybe like 7 or 8 episodes of this, so I want to mention it now. It's like, Netflix, this is not the way to go about things. Delaying the gratification for half the world, you know, almost a half year after Japan has seen it, may not be the best way to go. Maybe collect it and release it as 2 seasons, like episode 1 to 12 and 13 and 24. Do that. That's probably better. That way you can think of it as 2 seasons and there's only like 3-month gap in between. And it almost comes across as you're actually making these shows instead of just buying them from Japan and airing them elsewhere. Having Netflix exclusive anime is not really a problem because there are Crunchyroll streaming exclusives, Funimation streaming exclusives, Amazon Prime streaming exclusives, although Anime Strike, I think, is kind of on the rocks or dead now because I've stopped receiving emails for it. That being said, Carole Tuesday, I think, is kind of Netflix's way of like reviving an old director, which is something that they do a lot. They bring back big names from the past and try to get them to make new stuff because that brings eyeballs to them. Famously, they did this with Chris Rock and now Eddie Murphy and Jerry Seinfeld also in between by paying them just ludicrous amounts of money to make stand-up specials. I don't think they're paying even maybe 1/10 of that much money to license this anime. But it does have a big name attached to it. And really, that's what they're more concerned about. They have Cowboy Bebop already on their platform, and they want somewhere to push those viewers after they watch that, and they can say, this is by the same director, go watch this. And really, I think that's their biggest concern here, more than even the actual quality of the show. Not to say that the show is bad per se, but I would say that the show is inconsistent at times, although the directing has been better in recent episodes than in the past. What else do I say about this show? I mean, maybe we should save all my like huge industry thoughts for the end, but that was just kind of a little insight into what I've been thinking over the course of this show about Netflix and everything else that they've been doing in the anime space, especially related to shows that they, like buy in Japan and then air elsewhere. So that's it for this week, episode 18 of Carole Tuesday. So like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. I'll see you next week.